there's just so many buzzwords. Hey guys, I am Nova, and we're going to talk about how do you choose a monitor to buy in the year of our Lord 2021, and really in any other year. It's a topic that comes up quite a bit because, well, there are just so many monitors and so many, well, as the intro said, buzzwords that are floating around that can muddy the waters a bit and honestly make it a bit difficult to make your choice. So, we're going to hopefully make your choices a bit easier today by just trying to, guide you in the direction of which things you should look for when selecting a monitor that's best for your needs. The first question that you need to ask yourself for pretty much anything that you're going to buy is, what is your budget? Because ultimately, there are a lot of monitors that can do a lot of things and they can get quite fancy, and that fanciness, well, it comes with a price tag. So, set your budget first. And once you know your budget, then you know what you're even going to be playing with. And you can go from there. The next question you're going to want to ask is, what is it that I'm going to use this monitor for? Perhaps you're going to primarily use it for gaming. Or perhaps you're going to be watching a lot of Netflix, movies and television-related media on it. Perhaps it's just going to be for web browsing and some light documentation work, or maybe you're into video and photography and you want to do some editing on this monitor. Depending on what it is that you primarily will use it for will determine which features that monitor is going to have to excel at for you to get the most out of the monitor, because, well, not every feature a monitor can provide is necessarily something that you'll be interested in, and you want to get the most for those dollars. Now, we're going to get a bit more into each of those things because those features, well, that's really the meat and potatoes, of course, of what will help you determine your monitor selection. But there's one more question to ask before we get to that, and that is, how big do you want it, or how big will your space allow? Now, with that very obvious innuendo out of the way, let's bring it right back because we're going to first talk about size and resolution. And those two things go hand in hand because the bigger the monitor is, the higher the resolution is going to need to be to maintain sharpness. And if sharpness is something that's important to you, then it's, well, something to consider. For example, a 27-inch monitor, which is a pretty standard monitor size these days, if that was 4K, that's going to be really sharp because there's a lot of pixels per inch for that display. If you were to take 1080p and put it on that same 27-inch monitor, it's not going to be nearly as sharp. And so, once again, depending on what you might need or want, that is something to consider. Now, depending on what it is that you're actually using the monitor for, again, that might not be all that important. And let me give you some examples for when it might be important and when it might not be. Well, for one, gaming doesn't always have to be that razor sharp. And that's usually because there's not a lot of really fine text on screen for you to particularly notice just how sharp the display is. And when things are moving so fast all the time, you often wouldn't be able to tell that much of a difference anyway, at least most people. Now, if you're doing a lot of text-related things, you're reading a lot of news, or you're doing a lot of documentation or coding, then the sharpness and the clarity of text is going to be pretty important so your eyes aren't bleeding come the end of the workday. And so, well, that might be something then to take into consideration. Where is my voice going? Why am I slowly turning into Sean Connery? Next up, we're going to talk about refresh rate and VRR, which is variable refresh rate support. These are usually things that only gamers are particularly interested in because for the majority of the market outside of gaming, 60 Hz is plenty for everyday consumption. So for you gamers out there, I will caution this. Do not get caught up in the infinite chase for higher and higher refresh rates. There are very minimal returns after about 120 Hz that you need to be worried about chasing down. And I know that some of you might think that you're going to be the next Shroud, for example, and maybe I'm showing my age with that example, but you get what I mean. Unless you're somebody like Shroud, and you're able to make use of the absolutely minuscule visual bonuses that you get above, say, 120, 144, don't go chasing down stuff like 360 hertz, or at least don't feel you need to spend a huge amount of money to get there. Focus on other things, because there are other aspects of monitors that can actually be more visually improving for your gameplay than just raw speed. Now, as for VRR support, or variable refresh rate support, it is again mostly something that gamers are going to be interested in. And there are two types. There's NVIDIA's G-Sync and there's AMD's FreeSync. And the difference between the two of them? Mostly money. AMD has their FreeSync support, and it's a software-based solution, and it's open source, and so it's obviously far less expensive than NVIDIA's, which is hardware-based and requires their proprietary stuff to be slapped on the back of the monitor, which you don't have to do. It just comes with the monitor, of course, but it does add a lot of extra cost. Functionally, they're more or less the same for those of you at home. However, G-Sync and FreeSync gets a little muddy in terms of GPU support, and so that's going to require you to do a little bit of Googling to figure out what your monitor is capable of, what your GPU is capable of, and marrying the two. But if you want it to be really easy, NVIDIA GPUs for G-Sync, AMD GPUs for FreeSync, and if you want to start mixing and matching, just make sure that those things are indeed compatible. If you want an explanation of what VRR is beyond just the descriptive nature of its name, I can do my best to try to explain it at a basic level. Vertical sync, you probably already know, is where your graphics card and your monitor try to work together in unison to match each other at speed, meaning if you set your monitor to 120 Hz, the game is going to only output a maximum of 120 frames per second from your graphics card, so that you don't get that tearing that you get if you don't have vertical sync on at all. One of the downsides to vertical sync that's been known for a long time, no matter what version of vertical sync you're using, is input latency, and that's kind of unfortunate. It also means that there's not a lot of flexibility, because you're really locking yourself to that one maximum and not allowing the monitor to float up and down as you can with, well, variable refresh rates. These VRR options, whether it's FreeSync or G-Sync, are aiming to provide more of a range for your monitor and graphics card to work in unison, to once again provide no tearing, but again, this time, you can do something like 124, and maybe then it drops to 113 or 93, and the monitor and the graphics card continues to work together. You don't get screen tearing, and perhaps most importantly, in a lot of instances, you're getting less input latency, and that's pretty awesome. Next, we have local dimming, and this is something that, if I'm going to be honest, is not as useful when talking about monitors as it is talking about televisions, because I can't think of many examples off the top of my head of monitors that make proper use of local dimming. But what is local dimming? Well, more or less, it's zones within your monitor, and some monitors have more zones and some have less, that the monitor can shut off or turn on based on the content on your screen to help increase the, well, increase might be a bad word to use here, but you'll get what I mean, increase its ability to display darker darks. The problem is, of course, is that when you're dealing with zones like this, if you have something like, say, subtitles on your screen towards the bottom, depending on how many local dimming zones you have, you'll get this halo effect around the font, and that's just by nature of the local dimming zones not being able to be so fine that it can confine it to the text itself. Not a huge thing to worry about when it comes to monitors unless you're buying a TV for a monitor, which we will talk about later in this video, but still perhaps something that you might want to be interested in if you think you will be making use of local dimming. Now let's talk about contrast ratio. It's something I'm sure lots of you have already heard about or know about, and it's also unfortunately one of the most confused topics, because producers of panels tend to have a bad habit of creating their own measurements for what contrast ratio is. At least they have over the years. And that's why it's important to go to places like ratings.com, that's RTINGS.com, to get a better idea of comparisons between panels for contrast ratio, because they will give you the real measured contrast ratio that they found in the panels. Now, what is contrast ratio? Well, more or less, it's going to be what determines how black the blacks are, how white and bright the whites are, and the distance between those two things at their maximums on the display. It can be the difference between playing a horror game and everything is looking kind of gray versus playing that same horror game and the shadows are properly black and inky. A lot of displays for monitors, anyway, are not going to be particularly incredible because of the panel types that they use, with TVs often being better for contrast ratio, but in the vast majority of the cases, it's just best to compare contrast ratios between panels or monitors or televisions you're interested in, and keep it in mind that you're going to want to have a pretty good contrast ratio. Related to contrast ratio, to a certain degree anyway, is SDR and HDR peak brightness. Now, HDR isn't something that I would personally recommend chasing down in monitors right now, at least as of the making of this video, because, well, to be honest, not very many of them are actually any good at HDR, and within the Windows environment anyway, there's not a lot of HDR content that's all that hot. So maybe be worried more about SDR and only be sort of concerned with HDR unless you have very specific needs or wants. Peak brightness is kind of what it sounds like. It's how bright your panel will get, and that's most important when taking into consideration how bright the room is that you are in, that you're going to be using the monitor in as well. The brighter the room, the brighter the panel should probably be able to get to maintain nice visual clarity. And that's as complicated as it gets. When it comes to HDR, peak brightness also plays obviously a role in something like how bright the highlights get, which are really what HDR is largely about, but you don't need to worry, again, too much about that. Just worry about SDR for now, and worry about HDR on your televisions. Horizontal viewing angle. Now, I didn't think this gag through visually because, of course, my camera doesn't have a focus point over here. My microphone's going to sound terrible, so let me solve that. Let's just get back over here. We didn't really think that one through, did we? I don't know. Okay. Horizontal viewing angle. All it is how far off of center can you be before the image starts to degrade in any number of ways. If you're somebody who tends to perhaps, lean to one side or the other in their chair, or perhaps you're in an environment in which you have somebody over your shoulder off to one side, or perhaps even you're somebody that maybe when you're gaming and you are playing one of the 2 games in existence that allows you to have coach co-op and you're sitting kind of off angle, both looking at the same display, you get the idea. Depending on if you are one of those people, you might want to be more concerned about horizontal viewing angles, and perhaps also even more so if you're somebody doing video or photo editing, you want the display to look more or less the same regardless of how you're looking at it for as much of an angle as possible, because you need that image to be as representative of reality as you can. But for everyone else, if you are just sitting pretty much smack dab in the middle of that bad boy, you don't need to worry too much about it, but it is nice, when possible, to have an at least decent horizontal viewing angle. And now for something that I really consider to be important, and that is black and gray uniformity. Black uniformity will really become obvious when you play or do something in a darker room, because it has to do with the backlight bleed. Whatever it is that's lighting up your monitor based on your monitor's technology, it will end up with either some or none or a lot of black uniformity issues. And that's bleeding light into the corners usually of the screen, but sometimes it can be in other places too. And this really ruins, like I said, your experience when you're playing in a darker room. It will wash out areas of your monitor, and it does not look good. And usually, bad quality control will have bad black uniformity a lot of the time. So just be very aware of that. As for gray uniformity, if you're somebody that plays a lot of sports games or watches sports, or plays or does anything that has a lot of like blocks of color, like the green of a football pitch, for example. When the screen pans, if the gray uniformity isn't all that good, it will give you what's known as the dirty screen effect. It literally looks like your screen is a bit dirty. The better the gray uniformity is, the less you will get of that, and the nicer a picture. So if you can nail your black and gray uniformity, even if the rest of the panel isn't all that amazing visually, it goes a long way in bringing up the overall quality of your screen. Now this next one is more for all of you photo and video editing buffs out there, and that is pre and post calibration. Now if you're also somebody like me and you care at least a little bit about color accuracy, regardless of what content that you are consuming on your display, then this might also apply to you. Pre-calibration, of course, is what your monitor looks like as far as color accuracy right out of the box, whereas post-calibration is how good the panel is at being calibrated, because not all are created equal. Some out of the box are amazing, some out of the box are horrific, and really for anyone that's interested in doing color accurate work, post-calibration is more important because you're likely to be calibrating it anyway. And there's not a lot of monitors that those folks would be interested in the first place that don't calibrate to very good, if not excellent levels. For everyone else, if you're not likely to want to buy the equipment to do the calibration yourself or pay somebody to come in and do it for you, then perhaps pre-calibration is something that you might be interested in taking a look at when choosing your display. Now this next one is going to be important for anyone that is interested not only in color accuracy, but also how vivid, how true to life, how punchy, I suppose, the display can get. And that is SDR and HDR color gamut and color volume. Color gamut, whether you're talking about SDR or HDR, is how wide or how many colors within a certain color space the display is capable of producing. And the color volume is how much of a range of each of those colors it can display at various brightness levels. If you don't have a lot of color volume, for example, then things can get washed out, colors specifically. And if you don't have a very wide color gamut, then, well, you're just not going to be able to nearly as accurately display whatever it is that you are, well, trying to display. So, for gamers, that is the difference between a very washed out and boring looking adventure game, and for, of course, photo and video editors, that's the difference between your final output being accurate and perhaps not so accurate. Have you ever heard about plasma or even OLED TVs more recently having burn-in? Well, that's called image retention. And while not all monitors, and in fact not very many monitors, will have this issue, it's relatively important to make sure that it doesn't get any image retention, or at least not very easily, because for anything that's on a PC that's very static, which could be like the taskbar, for example, or in video games, UI elements, that kind of stuff can cause issues with panels that do get image retention. And so, just double check and make sure. And oftentimes, even if it does get a little bit of image retention, it tends to not be permanent, and there also tends to be situations in which it is more likely to happen. So if the reviewer of said panel says that it's not that big of a deal unless you do certain things, and those things don't apply to you, then go right ahead. But just something to keep in mind. Have you ever been watching something or perhaps even playing something and you're looking at a, let's say, sky, and the difference between the lightest blues going into the darker blues are really obvious, almost like there are lines in the screen? Well, that has to do with gradients and how well the monitor, as well as the source material, of course, but how well the monitor deals with those shifts across a spectrum of color. If that's something that you're interested in, maybe you've never even noticed it before, and I might have just ruined you. But if you're like me, and that bothers you at least a little bit, and you want that controlled within reason, then the gradient functionality of your panel is something to take a look at. A lot of monitors are pretty good at it. Obviously, if it's a 10-bit panel, it will be better than others at 8-bit, but even lots of 8-bit panels are pretty good these days. Just take a look. Maybe you don't care, but if you do, something to keep in mind. All right, my fellow gamers, this one is definitely for you. Now, everyone talks about refresh rate when it comes to having a crisp and smooth image on your display. But I would argue that perhaps equally as important is response time, both at your panel's native refresh rate and also at 60 Hz. And that would be if you were playing certain games at 60 FPS and locking your panel to that, or perhaps even plugging in a console, because some are limited to 60 FPS as well. So what is response time? Well, response time is how fast your display can change a pixel from one color to another color. If it's really quick, it's not going to be too blurry. If it's slow, you're going to get that smearing kind of effect that, well, nobody really likes to see. And so you can have a fast refresh rate but a slow pixel response time and still end up getting kind of that motion blur look, and that could be confusing for you. So keep in mind that not only is the refresh rate important, but the response time is as well. So be sure to check it out. If you're somebody that easily gets headaches while sitting at your desk looking at your monitor for long periods of time, that could be for a number of different reasons, but one that you might not be aware of is that it could be related to image flicker. And your display may or may not have image flicker, and for different reasons. The one that I tend to look out for the most, because it's one that you can't really easily avoid, is if it uses PWM as a method for brightness control. If it does, then it will have a certain level of flicker, and depending on the panel, it'll either be a higher hertz flicker or a lower hertz. Normally, the higher the hertz, the less likely it is to bother you, but the lower, you might want to stay away from. Another way in which your panel may have some form of flickering is if it uses black frame insertion to try and give better motion clarity. This is something that you can normally turn off, so it's not a huge deal, but it's also something to keep in mind if you do find that your monitor has that option. Now, the last feature that we're going to talk about today before we get into some bonus round type stuff is once again for gamers, and that is input lag. So what is input lag? Well, think of it like this. It's the time that it takes for you to, say, press jump, whether that's the spacebar or A or whatever it is for you. It's the time that it takes for you to do that and for you to see that action happen on your display. Of course, the faster that your display is in this regard, the more connected feeling you will be to your game as far as controls are concerned, and the better your experience. For everyone else, Netflix doesn't need to have a super high input lag rating in order to be an enjoyable experience, but for gamers, definitely something that you're going to want to keep in mind when purchasing your panel. Okay, so we've listed all of the most important features for the majority of people. You know why they're important and what to look for depending on what it is that you're concerned with in regards to your panel. But maybe you've got some other questions, and so maybe I'll answer them here in the bonus section. I'm going to talk a little bit about, is 4K really worth it? Is HDR really worth it? What about panel types, things like IPS, VAs, and OLEDs? And what about using TVs as monitors? I'm going to go over each of these, not in huge depth, but maybe I can then answer some questions that you'd have in that regard. One of the most frequently asked questions these days, especially for monitors, is 4K worth it? And the short answer is yes, and the long answer is, well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're just watching video or doing programming work or documentation work, then 4K is great because you don't need a powerful card to drive that resolution for those applications. However, if you are going to be doing gaming, that's a different animal altogether, and you're going to need a serious graphics card in order to reach that resolution at frame rates most of you would probably care about, whether that's 30, 60, or higher FPS. I would caution most people to avoid 4K for now unless you've got very deep pockets, because ultimately at the monitor sizes most people still play on today, whether that be 24, 27, or even 32 inches, 1440p is probably still king. You get really good images, and you don't have to spend so much money to get higher frame rates and better graphics settings at that resolution. But if you're somebody that doesn't mind spending a lot of money on their hardware and you just want the absolute best, then the short answer is, of course, yes, the higher resolution is better. Shocking, I know. Almost as frequently asked, if not more so, I suppose, these days, is HDR worth it? And like I talked about earlier in this video, HDR on monitors specifically, not TVs being used as monitors, but monitors specifically. It's not being done very well yet. It's very expensive to even get decent HDR, and even if you were to go that route, the implementation within a PC environment right now is not all that hot, and not necessarily something that I would personally say is worth chasing down for the premium that you pay at this time. However, if you're going to buy a TV as a monitor, then HDR is obviously something to take more into consideration because that TV is probably also going to be used for other applications, or at the very least will be giving you much better HDR on average than the majority of monitors on the market. Something else to keep in mind when it comes to HDR is that, like other metrics in which panels are rated by, for example, contrast ratio, manufacturers tend to really muddy the waters with their wording as to just how capable their panels are for HDR content. Lots of them will say that they're capable, or you'll see like HDR 400 or 600 or whatever. And a lot of people don't know what any of that means. Generally speaking, if you have to use a baseline, anything below HDR 1000 isn't even worth looking at. If you need more information than that, I urge you to go and watch some videos and read some documentation about the different types of HDR, because there are different types of HDR, which of those types are applicable to your situation, and then apply that knowledge to, well, choosing a panel. It really is not all that worth it within the realm of monitors. But when it comes to TVs, whether you're using it specifically as a PC display or a combo of PC and regular television use, that's something to be concerned more about on that side of the coin. Not so much for monitors, but do your research and don't just buy something because it says it's HDR compatible. Okay, so what about using a TV as a monitor? Well, I used to do it years ago. It's nothing that's particularly new, but it's becoming more and more common and more popular as things like the LG OLED displays enter the market at 48 inches and apparently possibly soon to be 42 inches. And they come with so many amazing features for gamers specifically that they're really gaining a lot of attention for this use. And so let's talk about that. There are a lot of features that the OLEDs from LG specifically come with, like VRR capabilities for NVIDIA G-Sync and AMD's FreeSync, as well as incredible HDR implementation, as well as having amazing color accuracy, volume, and everything else you would possibly want in most of your monitor panels, but at a much bigger size. You are, of course, going to pay more than you would for a lot of monitors, but on sale, some of these things are getting pretty close to a mid-upper range good gaming monitor. So it's no wonder it's becoming popular. Really, the only things that you need to keep in mind are, if it's OLED and not something like just a regular LED, keep in mind you do need to be a bit concerned about something like image retention or burn-in. And two, just because you can doesn't mean you should put it on something like a 30-inch deep desk and be sitting like this close to a 48-inch TV. I mean, it's just silly. Otherwise, go nuts. Alright, so I know this video is getting a little bit long in the tooth, but I've got one more topic to cover, and I promise I'm done. So just stay with me for this one. I want to talk quickly about the types of panels that you'll come across, if only because if you have a general, very general idea is what I'm about to give you of each of these panels, before you start diving into the nitty-gritty feature sets we talked about earlier in this video, it might make your search a bit faster and a bit easier to make. The 5 types that you're likely going to come across are LCD, LED, IPS, VA, and OLED. Some manufacturers have like weird in-between things in some of these categories or special versions in these categories, but ultimately those are the 5 panel types that you're going to be looking at. LCD is I gotta go fast and I don't care if I look particularly good doing it, but I'm going to be relatively inexpensive and live with it. LED is I still want to go fast, but I don't want to look so bad, and I don't mind if I cost a little bit more money. IPS is I want good viewing angles. I want my color accuracy to be really good, especially if it's not just a gaming IPS panel. I don't mind if I'm super quick. At least I don't need to be as quick as an LCD, but I still have some panels that are quick. VA is fast, good colors, good contrast, great, darks. For example, blacks get very, or closer to blacks anyway, in terms of these first few panel types. But it does have a downside, and its downside is that in high contrast areas, like let's say black text on a white background in a website or vice versa, and you scroll the screen, you might see some trailing behind those elements a little bit. And that might be dependent on the quality of the VA panel, but it is something to keep in mind. I personally have a VA panel and I love it, but just wanted to make sure you were aware of that one major flaw, I guess you would call, in a VA panel. And finally, OLED. Well, OLED is, I want to do everything amazingly, image retention be damned. That's it. You're going to pay for it. It's going to cost more money, but it's going to do just about everything, including, photo and video work if it's calibrated, just about as well as anything else in this list, if not better. And has a lot of flexibility. The problem, of course, is that it does have the tendency to have image retention or burn-in. It's hard to accomplish in some newer OLED panels, and that's going to get better and better with time, but it is something to always keep in mind, especially if you're using it as a PC monitor, because, of course, you're worried about things like UI elements within Windows and, as a gamer, UI elements in games. But that's it. That's the high-level look at all of the panel types. All right, we made it, guys. I promise this is the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I wanted to make something that was less about me just telling you what to buy and have it be instead give you information for you to be able to make more informed decisions on your own, whether you're watching other reviewers or reading articles, to suit your needs or wants specifically, instead of just relying on somebody to tell you, what they like or what they think you should buy. If that was what we accomplished today, please let me know in the comments section below. If you also have other recommendations for what you might like to see me do for videos in the future, feel free to tell me as well. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want to come back here and not miss any videos in the future. The usual spiel that every YouTuber gives you at the end of the video. Follow me on social media, all that stuff's in the description box below. I am Nova, and until I see you guys next time, stay safe out there and have a good one.